and you recognize that as well. Now, I should say, just a step back, I mean, obviously there's another solution to concurrent jurisdiction, which is get rid of it. I mean, you basically either give one of these two agencies priority, first dibs on a merger, or come up with a consensus as to which industry the other, or which topic area falls under which jurisdiction. That is, stop the concurrence, define it as this is my patch, this is your patch. But that's very difficult to do, especially if you don't have, if you can't engineer it in law. So these solutions are, this discussion is about what happens if you can't do that. In other words, you are damned to authorities having concurrent, having a say on mergers. So there's the recognition, and that each have this a similar role. There's also this unifying principle that generally in telecoms, it's the DOJ actually that is approving mergers. There's a certain set of cases that the FTC also looks at, but I'll just as competition authority in the United States, I'll speak in terms of the DOJ. DOJ and FTC have produced these merger guidelines that are very similar, share quite a bit with merger guidelines in many jurisdictions around the world. There's very little, in terms of best practice, very little distinction between the way you go about defining a market, the way you measure market power, the kinds of revenues you look at, the design of remedies, and so forth. These are set out in merger guidelines, and the FCC buys into this. Now, they have a different remit. They also have this additional requirement that that a merger has to be in the public interest. But in terms of the core analyticals, how you go about defining markets, there's agreement, there's total agreement. There's also an analytical consistency. We don't, for example, for definition of market, for measurement of market power, we use sophisticated economics. We don't, for example, when it comes to measurement of market power, we don't say it's 50% market share. The market share may suggest market power, but you can't just pick a number. So you have to go beyond looking at thresholds that could be calculated by an accountant or a casual observer, and look at the real nature of the market, how that market power is created and maintained, and so forth. Now, another aspect here is coordination. So even though there is no formal coordination between the FCC and the DOJ, there's nothing written up anywhere. They do work very closely together. There is the FCC process is all public, and the DOJ will actually submit. They'll actually submit filings to an FCC process, but beyond that, the staffs of the two will work together. The other thing is that in these, one of the biggest issues with having a dualistic regime is that it just takes long. You have to file twice, and you have to wait for each agency to get through its process. But if there are time limits, then a lot of the anxiety the harm that could be done to merging parties can be minimized. This is one area that I think you'll see in the United States. There'll be some change. The FCC actually doesn't. It has a self-imposed time limit to take a decision on some of these issues, but it's self-imposed. It's not something they need to adhere to, and in certain cases, like the recent AT&T and T-Mobile issue, they ignored it entirely. So the message is that even though it appears that in terms of the immediate future, there may be some additional issues coming up in terms of institutional tension, conflict. There are ways, even accepting the law as it's written, that the two agencies can find a way to work together and ensure that the mergers and acquisitions process, which is increasingly important, goes forward and operates smoothly.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you so much. We'll take up questions later, but for giving hope that it is possible for duality to work together towards one common goal. The interesting thing that comes up is that I think if you take off from Subhashish, the antitrust and the competition thing, one benchmark was the network economics, and now he's given another one. How they bypass it by getting into a cartel in terms of buying of the auction, which DOJ in its merger rules will have to look at it, and I think this was also pointed out in our reference to the tri-paper on M&A. But last, we have a former regulator who's seen it all and gone through, and from Sri Lanka, which had the earliest ones on liberalization in the telecom sector.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for this opportunity. A lot of my funders, what did I do? Think that all the problems in telecom have been solved, and therefore we don't need to do any more research or activities in this area. So this is a distinct pleasure to be able to, you want to do this? To be able to talk about these subjects, not on the basis of some immediate recent research, as I normally do when I come to Delhi, but on the basis of sort of overall impression. As I said in my self-introduction, I began to engage with the Indian regulatory process back in 1998, when I was one of the people who established the South Asian Telecom Regulators Council, and Justice Sodhi and Mr. Deputy Chairman, Mr. Sutshi, came and participated in those activities. And since then, I have been fortunate to have continuous engagement with all the succeeding TRAI chairs. So I came to Sri Lanka around the same time that people like Justice Sodhi and Dr. Harshavardhana Singh came back. I had been teaching policy and regulation in the United States, and my government invited me as a sort of an outsider to come and help set up the regulatory agency. The basic thinking in the United States is of regulation being there to safeguard consumers. But as I came here and I began to engage with the process, I began to realize very quickly that the more important function that was being played by the regulator was to create a better environment for investment, and that it was part of this institutional arrangement that is the heading of this session, which is regulatory and institutional framework. And Rajat, who I believe would have co-authored or authored this document, says we require a review of the institutional structure and regulatory framework at this time. So we had just set up a particular institutional structure and regulatory framework at that time. And the key element of that institutional design was the separation of operations, the supply of telecommunication services by the Department of Telecommunications, became BSNL and so on, and the separation of regulatory functions, which was the reason why we set up TRAI in India, in other countries by other names, and concentrating the department or the ministry on policy functions. So I was thinking back then, what is the way in which I could really assess my efficacy as a regulator? Is it because I bring people lower prices? Is it because I give them better quality of service? And that didn't seem quite realistic actually at that point, because here was a country where we had, well, this is a small country, Sri Lanka, with a population of 20 million. We had hundreds of thousands of people on waiting lists, right? So the issue was not really about lower prices. It was about giving people telecommunications. So could I use the number of connections that were being given as my indicator of success? I wasn't giving connections. I wasn't running the telephone companies, which had been privatized. It really seemed to me that my task, my success depended on whether I was creating the conditions for greater private investment in the sector. So as part of that thinking, and there was no easy way of measuring regulatory effectiveness, we developed an instrument later. Now, after I had left government, we developed an instrument called the Telecom Regulatory Policy and Regulatory Environment Instrument. Basically, we took 7 criteria on which there was almost universal agreement, in the sense that these were included in the regulatory reference paper of the WTO: market entry, scarce resources, interconnection, universal service, and we added tariff regulation and quality of service regulation. Actually, the last one was added at the request of TRAI. So when we did this, what we did was we took a weighted sample of investors, people working in the companies at very senior CXO level. We took people who were public interest advocates, journalists, and so on. We took investment advisors, lawyers working in the sector. We took a large sample of about 100 people, and we made sure that each of these groups contributions were statistically weighted equally. And we gave them a very short 5 points Likert scale questionnaire, so that they would actually fill up the questionnaire rather than give it to some underling. And we developed the results for a range of countries: Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Thailand, Philippines, and so on. And when I was doing this, I always had to explain, when I was presenting the results, I had to explain that whereas in other countries, most of these functions were handled by a quasi or really autonomous regulatory agency, in India, it was separated. Market entry, spectrum, universal service were controlled by the Department of Communications. And the other matters were controlled by TRAI. So we had to say, we are not assessing a particular regulatory agency. We are looking at the regulatory and policy environment. So in this period, particularly after the readjustments of 1999 and 2002 and so on, the Indian sector was growing very fast. I used to joke about it, saying, you people are adding in a month what our entire population in Sri Lanka is, to give people a sense of the scale of the activity that is going on here. But again, if you really looked at it, 50% of all the foreign investment that was coming into Pakistan at a certain point was in the telecom sector. And the Pakistan sector was exploding. Pakistan had fallen back behind India, behind Sri Lanka, and it just simply exploded after 2004. So this comparative analysis, which we no longer do, the last time I think we did it was in 2011, was quite illuminating, quite educative, in terms of getting a sense of what was working, what was not working. Now, if I were to teach about regulation, regulatory procedures, which I do even these days, I tend to refer to India's consultation policies, its requirements to have open houses and so on as exemplary elements. If I were to talk about doing good policy, this may not make you very happy, but I sometimes do refer to Pakistan's 2004 rules, which were quite exemplary, and I will maybe refer to them as I move on. So India has got very good, I would say, formal procedures in terms of the appellate tribunal. For example, I was very skeptical when they set up the appellate tribunal. I thought this would add enormous number of delays. And in actual fact, I was wrong. And they managed the delay problem quite reasonably. But there's another test that I could use. As part of what I do, moderating sessions, giving talks all over the region, ITU, APT, all these associations, I tend to meet a lot of the regulatory personnel of the regional investor companies. And sometimes I see these guys and say, hey, how come I don't see you in Colombo? We don't need to come to Colombo. Our time is taken up by India and Bangladesh. So in a way, that's an indicator that they have more problems. They need to focus regulatory resources in certain countries, and in other countries, while the procedures are more opaque, the policies are not so good on black and white, things are actually getting done, and that in some countries, I'm sorry to say, including in India, this is seen as a sort of a regulatory sinkhole, which is extremely difficult for the investors to manage. Now, I know that Mr. Chidambaram has said, what are you talking about all these uncertainties? People are still investing in India. Vodafone is putting more money in. All these claims about regulatory uncertainty are not true. But I believe that if you take a dispassionate view, there is a problem here. There is a need to build a third and fourth generation. India you're still talking about 3G. I walk around in the cities of India and I can't see 3G on my roaming phone. I don't know about you, but I can't. When I walk around in Sri Lanka, I get 3G more or less all the time on my phone. And we've had 3G. I can remember I was in government when we let it, gave the trial license. That was in 2003. 2003. And I'm going home and I've been offered a 4G phone for 36,000 Sri Lankan rupees by the company which is offering 4G. So in a way, you do have a problem. You may not like to hear it, but you have a problem. The country that is the ICT sort of brand that we think of is India, not Sri Lanka. But you guys are really falling behind. There is something that needs to be done, and what needs to be done essentially is to build an entire data network on top of the existing voice network. You can't be happy with the voice network that you got. You need to build a data network on top of that. That requires investment. That requires a new policy and regulatory environment, a new framework, as has been correctly identified in the concept paper that this session is based on. So what has actually happened? How come you had all this dynamism and it has sort of wound down? Now I'm going to say some hard truths. This is after lunch. I want to see whether you are awake. When the TRAI was set up, there was a conscious attempt to take people who were not in the operator and in that culture. Justice Sodhi was brought from outside. Deputy Chairman Suchi was brought in from international trade. Dr. Harshavardhan Singh was brought in from the WTO. Several other key people like Mr. Rajendra Singh, Mr. Satyan Gupta here, they were brought in from the railways. What is the situation now? I think you know what has happened. It is basically, what we've got is, you're telling the world that you have separated operations, policy, and regulation. Because this is BSNL, this is DOT, and this is TRAI. I'll tell you, I know these people. I come in and out of these places all the time. You spend your entire career in BSNL, and when you're senior enough, you become a senior official in the DOT. There are one or two people. I know Mr. Chandrasekharan came from the other side. I know my friend Ravi Shankar came from the other side. But just in terms of aggregate numbers, look at the look and feel of DOT. DOT is BSNL, senior people. And where do they go after they finish with DOT? You know the answers. I don't have to tell you this. Right? And this is not limited to you. By the way, I'm not somebody. We are part of the region. This is a place that is sort of the center of gravity of what I do. Right? Same thing has happened in Sri Lanka. We had a bad institutional structure. We had a very energetic time when we were doing a lot of regulation and reforms. And now the whole place, the regulator has gone to sleep. Right? I'm not defending. I'm not saying they are any better. If you want me to criticize the Pakistan or Bangladesh regulatory agencies, I can do that. I do that in their countries. Right? That is sort of the license that I have as a guy who's been around the block many times. So I'm telling you, there's no point in my criticizing Pakistan to you. I'm telling you what has happened here. You have a situation where the